Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 21st of April 2021. And in this programme tonight, we'll be talking about the International Criminal Court and their vile and evil investigation alleging that Israel has committed war crimes and putting Israel on a moral parity with Islamist genocidal terrorist organisations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So we will be unpacking this globalist institution that is not fit for purpose and exposing its agenda, that with the European Union. And also I'd like to thank personally all those who watched the Zoom interview that I did last night with the new Israeli ambassador, Zippy Hotzer-Levy. Former Deputy Foreign Minister, Minister in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, and now Israel's new ambassador to the UK. So if you watch that, very, very grateful. So thank you for doing that. Regan, we're talking about the ICC. Now, there seems to be absolute corruption within the International Criminal Court. This organisation was set up to actually confront real genocides and acts of crimes against humanity. And yet they've decided the only country they are going to pick on and single out is, surprise, surprise, the Jewish state, Israel, which is governed by the rule of law, surrounded by terrorist entities and enemies that want to destroy her. And yet this organisation's entire focus now is trying to bring prosecution against Israeli leaders and Israeli military generals and those who served in the IDF.
Yeah, this is an unprecedented move by the ICC, by any body of its kind, because if you look at Israel, it has a right to its statehood. It is a recognized state. It has jurisdiction. It is a democracy. It is functioning. It has its own accountability structures that are there. Palestine, around the world,
we call it Palestinian Authority.
Right.
It's not a country yet, thankfully.
Exactly, and that's the exact point that I'm going to make. It is not a state. It is not recognized as a state. It lacks the ability to meet the criteria that the international bodies have recognized and agreed to for statehood. And so what we're looking at is a situation where some politicization has entered this process. We didn't see the same treatment of ISIS in northern Iraq, particularly in regard to the Yazidis. We've not seen any response by them in relation to the Uyghurs in China. We've not seen anything regarding Myanmar and what's happening on an ongoing basis there. It's not fit for purpose.
Chechnya, Russia.
Chechnya,
Russia,
we were talking about 2 weeks ago.
Absolutely. So there's something very much
dodgy.
Yeah, that's probably a good English expression. It's dodgy. Let's just put it down to that. And if we have a look, really, I mean, this really came about after Israel's defensive war known as Operation Protective Edge back in the summer of 2014. But to put in context, I think it's important to establish what is the International Criminal Court and why it was established, just to give context. So the International Criminal Court was established in The Hague in 1998 through the Statute of Rome. To put it in its context, the 1990s were a very bad decade for human rights. So we had the ongoing civil war in the former Yugoslavia, in which we saw the Serbians massacre and try to ethnically cleanse the Muslims in Bosnia. We also then saw that we had the ethnic cleansing in Darfur and, of course, the horrendous genocide that took place in Rwanda. And this is the context in which the International Criminal Court was founded in order to actually tackle real crimes of genocide.
Where there was no accountability, where there was nothing being done. So essentially in those situations you had these legislative black holes, essentially, where an international body that could hold these organizations, these groups to account was set up. But we've not really, despite it being a nice idea, there were concerns at the time. Israel refused to sign up to it, even though it was at the forefront of recognizing the need for a body post-Holocaust that could try and convict and make decisions based on war crimes across the board. It was actually confident, seemingly, that this could be used to weaponize this anti-Israel sentiment that is in very many places. And that's what we're seeing here. Bill Clinton, he actually he signed the Rome document that was there, but there was no ratification of it in the Senate. So there's reluctant involvement of the U.S. And it should be said that the ICC has, while failing to do anything about ISIS and saying they couldn't do anything about ISIS and protesting that this isn't to do with them or it's out of their purview, they've gone after the United States. In fact,
Afghanistan, yeah.
Biden, it's only recently that President Biden has lifted various sanctions against the people involved in the ICC.
Posed by President Trump. But also I think it's important to notice two things. One is that the idea of an international criminal court was one of the ideas come up by Israel, because as you mentioned, after the horrors of the Holocaust and certainly after the Eichmann trial, they felt there was a need to bring justice to perpetrators of genocide and crimes against humanity, which is true. But of course, this is being used in the wrong way. And then you follow this up by the fact that, for example, their refusal to actually look into any war crimes against humanity, genocide committed by ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, even though many of those that joined ISIS to fight for the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq come from member states, European member states, who have signed up to the International Criminal Court and signed up to the Statute of Rome. So there is something that can be done legally to bring prosecution against those vile genocidal terrorists known as ISIS, and they haven't done that. So it just shows you that this is the danger is, I think, with all of this, and this comes to the point and the key core of this whole discussion, is what we're seeing really is the politicization of international law, not based on justice, not based on rights, just based upon Trump lies put together by the Palestinian Authority, supported by the International Criminal Court, and even their own abiding codes to be part of the International Criminal Court and to sign up the Statute of Rome. They've completely changed the criteria in order which the Palestinian Authority can join, because they've recognized them as a state, even though they're not a state.
Right. Simon, a couple of months ago, we looked at persecution of Christians in various places. And Nigeria, we saw, has entered that top tier level and the top 10 places where it's most dangerous to be a Christian. And of course, viewers would be very familiar, I'm sure, with Boko Haram. Has the ICC, what have they done in their response with Boko Haram?
Made a report, but haven't done anything else.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah. And this is the same across the board. They're making political issues, that they're actually making themselves or giving themselves authority that they do not have to recognize what is a state and what is not a state. So they've recognized the Palestinian Authority as a state, and it seems very likely that a large part of this is to almost recognize Israel as an illegitimate state. So there's not good intentions here at all. Now, Britain is a member of the ICC as part of its, it signed the Statute of Rome as part of its previous membership in the EU. But thankfully, we are taking a line, our Prime Minister is taking a very strong line against this measure undergoing by the ICC, and I think we can give much thanks for that.
No, definitely. I think that's very important. So just to let you know, we are live, we are interactive tonight. This is your programme, and we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to email or text into the programme. And our question we're posing for tonight is, has the International Criminal Court failed to prosecute genocides? We want to know your thoughts on the International Criminal Court and its desire to single out Israel. And let's have a look now at this excellent CBN report that looks into the International Criminal Court's investigation for so-called alleged war crimes against Israel.
Several years ago, Palestinians asked the ICC to investigate Israel for war crimes. Last month, judges decided they had jurisdiction over the area known as the West Bank and Gaza. Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor driving this investigation, focuses on the 2014 Gaza war. While she calls out Hamas for crimes such as attacking Israeli civilians and using its own people as human shields, Bensouda also charges Israel responded too strongly, leaving dead and wounded Palestinians in its wake. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed the prosecutor's decision.
I think this is an outrageous decision that goes against the one democracy in the Middle East, Israel, whose soldiers honorably and scrupulously do everything to avoid civilian casualties as they're fighting the worst terrorists on earth. This is pure anti-Semitism.
The prosecutor also expands her charges to the so-called occupied territories, which refers to Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and eastern Jerusalem.
I'm in Jerusalem, not very far from the old city of Jerusalem, which has been our capital since the time of King David for 3,000 years. They say that if we build a house in Jerusalem, that's a war crime. The ICC, the International Court, was built to prevent the kind of horrors that were committed on the Jewish people by the Nazis, and now they're turning their guns on the one and only state of the Jewish people.
Hamas welcomed the decision as a step forward to implement justice.
Hamas stresses clearly and decisively that the resistance by our Palestinian people and all the resistance by the national factions in Palestine are a legitimate resistance, and its natural role is to resist the occupation and restore the land and the holy places according to all international laws.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who could also be a target of the investigations, says the ICC probe rewards terrorism and terror organizations.
Israel is the only situation where the court is investigating a non-member state at the behest of a member, the Palestinian Authority, which is not a state.
International law expert Eugene Kontorovich says regardless of any decision against Israelis, the court has no enforcement authority. He adds, however, the impact would be on the world stage.
What this really is about is the Palestinians seeking to establish the fact of their statehood and their maximalist borders outside of negotiations. So the Palestinians, they don't need anything else to happen for them to have already won.
Kontorovich says, bottom line, Israel should not even address the charges since the court has no jurisdiction over it.
But Israel should definitely ignore it. It should treat it as a hostile political entity.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And indeed, the hostile political entity that is the Palestinian Authority has been well documented. We have an organization that sponsors terror groups. That constitution is set on destroying and wiping clean, in their view, the land for themselves, ridding it of all Jews. So that's that constitution, and that's there. This is what the ICC is, in effect, supporting. Here we have something from Graham. Graham says, guys, great job. You probably will come to it, but what do we best as believers do to influence the future function of this court? Pray, yes, but what actions apart from that? Shalom, God be with you.
We need to just write to our political representatives, our MPs, and say, look, We very much support the Prime Minister's decision to condemn the ICC on singling out Israel and putting Israel on a moral comparison with genocidal terrorist organizations, and Israel as a nation not being able to defend itself against such horrendous acts of terrorism. So that's the first thing that you can do. And also, we know that our best weapon is always prayer and intercession, and pray that this would just get exposed. But after all, and this is going to be the conclusion of the program, that those who bless Israel shall be blessed, and those who curse Israel shall be cursed. So there'll be a big curse coming upon the ICC and the European Union, because God is a jealous God, particularly when it comes to his people and his land.
Now, some viewers may be asking the question, okay, well, of course, no nation is past a point of criticism. There's no country that can't be investigated in some way. So it might be helpful to discuss the history behind the ICC investigation into Israel, and just to kind of get a refresher as to why we're at this point, and see if we can put the pieces of the puzzle together. So,
Regan.
yeah, the starting point of the investigation against Israel and Palestinian terror organizations is 13th of June in 2014. This was covered in the mainstream media at the time from a particular angle, of course. The day before, there were 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped, and they were kidnapped by Hamas terror cell in Judea. They were dressed up as Orthodox Jews, and they were later murdered by Hamas. Hamas then fired thousands of rockets. This is a routine thing. There's thousands of rockets on a routine basis fired into Israel. My wife has spoken repeatedly of hearing the sirens and of having to go into the bomb shelter. They fired thousands of rockets and missiles into Israel, paralyzing 2/3 of the country. Israel then, what should it do, Simon? What should a country that is being bombed?
Well, the European Union, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations think that Israel should just take it.
Right.
That Israel should not protect its citizens, should stand back and say that we have the moral high ground, and we are not going to respond to our civilians being murdered by genocidal terrorists such as Hamas.
Yeah.
That's what the international community expects of Israel. But the duty of any government is first to protect its citizens.
Absolutely.
So, but there's an interesting story. I want to bring in something I haven't put in my notes here, that you can actually look this up. There was a Daily Mail story back in the summer of 2014. And it tells a story of how this one missile was heading to the Haredi Towers. And if any of you have been to Tel Aviv and you come from Jerusalem on the main highway, you'll notice 2 extremely big towers, and it's cool to go up them. And this one rocket was heading straight for those towers. So they put out an emergency alert to get all Israel's emergency services ready for a mass casualty. And the radio operator that was actually monitoring this missile said, "Look, this is awful. Just there's nothing we can do. It's going to hit the Haredi Towers." And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this gust of wind pushed that rocket into the sea. Now, if you've been to Tel Aviv in July, is there a wind? No. And it's so far away as well from the sea as well, that the IDF operator said, there is a God. This is a miracle. So the only reason that Israel didn't have so many casualties in that war was primarily because of Israel's missile defense program known as the Iron Dome, that prevented so many rockets and missiles landing in Israel. Literally, the Israelis had 10 or 15 seconds to get into bomb shelters. 2/3 of the population were cut off. They couldn't go to their schools. They couldn't go to their homes. And for the first time, Tel Aviv was actually in the realm of these rockets and missiles, where people in Tel Aviv think they are immune to the conflicts in the Middle East. And this really shook them up, even Herzliya as well. So, this was a war that Israel had to respond to those rockets and missiles. And then we know that Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, sent in its armed forces into Gaza, very chilling. And then they discovered these terror tunnels that Hamas had actually planned to have. They've dug tunnels into Israeli territory. And for Rosh Hashanah in 2014, they were planning to take a mass load of civilians from the local villages and kibbutzes nearby, take them back into Gaza and hold them hostage, which would have been absolutely horrendous. So I think the Lord, in his insight and wisdom, allowed Israel to take out Hamas in Gaza. But the worst thing about the IC investigation is they decide to start the investigation after the trigger point of the awful kidnapping and murder of these 3 young Israeli teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of these things, by the way, very well documented. I remember the story that you were telling about of the missile, incredible miracle there. There were 50 days of fighting. There were 2,100 Palestinian casualties. Most of them were terrorists. And, you know, in this situation where you often have the Palestinian Authority using civilians, even children.
I have to make a distinction here because the Palestinian Authority weren't involved. This was Hamas. So Hamas, the genocidal terrorist organization that took over Gaza off in 2007, when literally they were throwing Fatah PLO members off buildings and took over control of Gaza after Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005. That is when they created a terror entity in Gaza. So it's not the Palestinian Authority. This is Hamas, and it's a genocidal
purely Hamas. So they
and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is an Iranian-sponsored Palestinian terror organization.
But the ICC has done nothing in regard to that. They've not addressed it.
No, they've condemned them, and they're under investigation. But the danger is with this one is that modern warfare now is not state against state or country against country. Maybe we might see something in Russia and the Ukraine, we'll have to see. But effectively, it's against terror entities. So terrorist organizations against state actors. And of course, they don't play by the game, by the rules. They don't comply by the Geneva Convention. They use something called asymmetrical warfare. In other words, they use women and children as human shields, and then they fire their rockets and missiles from highly populated, dense areas in order to attract a mass number of casualties from the other side. So they can say, we're the victims, look, you are killing innocent people, and then this becomes a media war, and the media report, look at the evil Israelis destroying buildings, but it's never put in context.
So am I understanding this correct? Hamas is condemned by the ICC.
They're investigating Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as well.
But they are investigating and they're condemning Israel for responding to these actions of Hamas.
Exactly. They're putting them on the same. They're putting them on the same moral parity as a genocidal terrorist organization. When Israel is actually governed by international law. Israel has a Supreme Court that even arrests prime ministers and presidents. And Israel carries out its own investigations into IDF soldiers that breach protocol. And the Israelis, unlike the Americans, think first before they fire. So therefore, they will only fire if they're in very difficult circumstances. During that conflict, they sent out leaflets on Gaza. They told the whole population, in a couple of hours, we're going to bomb this area because Hamas is there, move out. So even giving them text messages and everything else to make sure that the number of civilian casualties that died in that conflict would be minimized.
I messaged a Jewish friend earlier in the day talking a little bit about this and what's been going on to feel out his take on it. And he said much of what you've mentioned, but one thing that needs to be highlighted, Israel, and you touched on it just now, it has one of the most restrained...
The most.
The most restrained tactic of responding to acts of aggression against it. You know, we say, are you supposed to just sit there and take it? Like many assume Israel should just do that, but it routinely has rockets fired at it. The Iron Dome intercepts, and thankfully most civilians are kept safe. But if we're talking about the United States, and this is what my Jewish friend was telling, he said, how would the U.S. be if Mexico started firing rockets into the U.S.?
Well, under Biden, they probably let them.
Well, yeah. But in normal circumstances, you would think, okay, if rockets are being fired from,
Exactly, they would respond.
you're going to respond. Not only will you will respond with speed, you will respond with force, you'll probably take over the whole place.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, absolutely.
But Israel's not done that, and has consistently, I mean, we have seen over the years where there have been invasions, where there have been responses, but consistently we've seen an olive branch offered. Consistently we've seen a desire for peace.
And I've interviewed Israeli soldiers that actually went into Gaza, and they tell a story of how they end up rescuing Palestinian civilians in Gaza from Hamas.
Yeah.
They put their own lives on the line. They've given them food. They've given them protection, and they've actually put themselves in the firing line in order to protect the civilians population in Gaza. But the mainstream media won't report that. But you get that on Behind the Headlines and the Middle East Report.
And to that effect, Anita writes, "It's always a pleasure to see you both. You bring us news that we actually want to know about. This is such a ridiculous charge, it's almost unbelievable. For years, the poor Israelis have had to tolerate being constantly under attack. They have merely sought to defend themselves. Yes, innocent people have died, which is regrettable, but they have had no choice but to retaliate. The anti-Semitic agenda that we're seeing now is shocking. Islam is and always has been an evil institution. I pray constantly, and I will happily lobby my MP to support Israel. I have and always will defend them. Blessings to you both, your families, and everyone at Revelation TV." We have this from Jacqueline. "Bless you both. Thank you for bringing this to our attention and for all you do." And finally, "Hi, Simon and Regan. The Biden administration couldn't care about Israel or the criminal court, but Jesus knows everything and what's to come. Shalom."
Yeah. Well, we can talk about the spiritual aspects of this. Is that the danger with this one is that principalities and powers of darkness actually get behind these institutions, and what starts off as nothing becomes massive. But let's go to an interview that I recorded earlier today with one of our leading Christian barristers, and Regan knows him very well. And this is Paul Diamond's thoughts on this ridiculous, evil and corrupt investigation looking into Israel's alleged war crimes. We are now joined on Behind the Headlines by one of this country's most prestigious and leading Christian barristers who has done so much to protect Christian freedoms in this country. This is Paul Diamond. Paul Diamond, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines.
Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
Pleasure. And Paul, can I ask you, please, can you give a historical understanding as to why the International Criminal Court in The Hague was established back in 1998?
Well, The Hague is becoming a very important place in international law, and I think it's one of the great challenges now to somehow counter, if I could put it in that phrase, the development of The Hague. Two courts sit in The Hague, and I'll give some background on it. The first is the International Court of Justice, which deals with international disputes referred to by member states of the United Nations. And the second one is the International Criminal Court, who actually now has a prosecutor from the United Kingdom, a man called Karim Khan. And that is a semi-autonomous body in which it can initiate prosecutions for war crimes or crimes against humanity and such like, on its own initiative. Now, there are a number of issues I feel Christians should be aware of. Well, of course, all these international projects sound wonderful. The UN was a wonderful opportunity for the nations to speak together. But, it's got so bad that countries have felt they should leave the United Nations, or they only participate in the United Nations because it's a convenient forum to discuss with opposing figures issues of international affairs. Likewise, when the International Court of Justice was established, which was a build on from the League of Nations Court, it was hoped that this forum would deal with disputes between nations, and it hasn't really fulfilled its role. And the International Criminal Court follows that hubris that international crimes against humanity and war crimes should be pursued, and these criminal states should be held accountable for their acts. However, as usual in the United Nations, they're not really courts, they're not lawful, they're highly politicized entities in which the target states are self-evident, and Israel is always going to be in the crosshairs of any international forum, no matter what it does. Now, just by way of background, give you some examples. Firstly, going back to the other court, the International Court of Justice, the UN court, the vice president of the UN court is a lady called Professor Hu Hanquin. Ironically, she is a professor from Wuhan University. You couldn't make it up, I don't think. She's vice president, and because vice presidents in the rotation system in the court become president, there will be a Chinese president of the International Court of Justice in 2022. It goes without saying that China is a lawless state. It's a thug state. It's doing to Uyghurs and Christian groups and Falun Gong, probably mispronounced that, the most horrendous crimes against humanity. It also goes without saying that China is internationally lawless, and some of the listeners to this show and viewers might be aware of the dispute between the Philippines and China on some ocean islands and international waters. China's actually lost that dispute. The Philippines took it under the Convention on the Laws of the Sea to the arbitration tribunal, and China lost. It's got a clear international ruling against it, and they've just simply disobeyed it, sent their fishermen in, and they're not fishermen, trust me. They are very robust members of the Chinese military, and they've seized the water in spite of it. And that country is going to chair the International Court of Justice.
Paul, when it comes to this ICC investigation, which in my opinion is vile, it is evil, it seems like the International Criminal Court was set up to deal with international genocides in the 1990s, when we saw the horrendous genocides take place in Bosnia and also in Rwanda, and also we saw against in Western Sudan as well, in Darfur, and yet it seems to be a complete failure, because they failed to investigate ISIS for war crimes, even though many of those joined ISIS from countries that had signed up to the International Criminal Court and the Statute of Rome. And yet here we see that Israel is being singled out. Isn't there a great danger that we are seeing the politicization of international law? And what is the danger if this process continues?
Well, I mean, it's totally political. I mean, one of the ironies is, one of the criteria for the International Criminal Court is whether the country has an independent, robust, and free of political influence judicial system. The irony is, not only does Israel is the only state in the Middle East to have that, but in world terms, and people may find this hard to believe, the Israeli judicial system is unparalleled. It's amazing this small country has produced a judicial system that has no hesitation in challenging Israeli prime ministers. Indeed, Netanyahu's got a bit of trouble on his hands at the moment, nor has it challenged wall building or positions. So the irony is, it has an independent court and it's doing it. But the whole process from beginning to end has been politicized. Palestine, in international law, is not a state. Palestine is bound by the Oslo Accords. It has constantly become observer status at the UN. It's a renegade on the Oslo Accords repeatedly. It's seeking to subvert the settlements process within those accords. And it joined the ICC, even though it's not a state, with the express purpose of going for Israel. And this investigation is totally ludicrous and it's totally politicized. The first point is the ICC has chosen the date, it's retroactive to the 13th of June, viewers may not be aware of this, on 2014, including a review of Operation Protective Shield and Israel's military actions. The reason they've taken the 13th of June was because on 12th of June 2014, there was a serious terrorist incident and number of murders of Israeli citizens, which led to Operation Shield. So they're already set the parameters, not for an independent investigation, but they've set the very date at the behest of a country that shouldn't be a member of it to investigate Israel. Now, the other factor of the case is, of course, they opened up this inquiry, the Palestinians sought this to be opened up in 2015, go for Israel, a lot of support. They announced they were going to go for Israel actually in December 2019. The decision by the court to go for Israel was February the 5th, 2021, after the Biden administration was entrenched. And therefore, the decision was made, in my view, with the approval of the Biden administration. Now, it's very clear that some of the American political aims, what they're working on. First, we know the agenda is going to boot back with Biden to the Palestinians and Israel and all that focus. And this court inquiry and be masquerading as a court in which Israel is singled out, not Russia, Soviet Union in the Ukraine, that will never happen. Not China's mass murders against the Uyghurs, that will never happen. But Israel and a few other African dictators are thrown in to boot every now and again if they're weak enough for the court to review. Now, one of the interesting things is the anti-Trump mania reached such a frenzy in the international circles that people may or may not be aware that in March 2020, the International Criminal Court opened up an investigation against the United States on its troops' activities in Afghanistan. That was unheard of because, of course, the United States is a major player. You don't go against China, you don't go against Russia, you don't go against the United States. I suspect some form of deal has been cut with the ICC and the Biden administration, that there will be some soft cooperation with the American soldiers, but it won't happen again, and they won't touch America again. But no holds barred on Israel. And I think Israel is in a dilemma on this. It's a new form of warfare, so it's got a quasi-judicial spin, and you know what the media are going to do. They're going to take every allegation from the Palestinians proven fact and every statement of truth by the Israelis as a deceitful, manipulative, murderous excuse. And it's going to go forward on that basis. But the alarming thing is not that Israel isn't even a member of the ICC, nor is the United States not a member of the ICC, but 120 other countries are members of the ICC. And when a ruling is given, as it will be against Israel and not Hamas, or Hamas hasn't got the organization, or it's not the official government, it was some private terrorist group, all 120 countries are bound, who are signatories, to enforce the judgment of the ICC. So there's going to be a lot of Israeli citizens, including prime ministers potentially of Israel, and senior military staff and people who live in the West Bank, probably subject to international arrest warrants. And that'll be extremely dislocating to Israel.
Absolutely, which is absolutely shocking. But I'm concerned about the International Criminal Court placing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and giving them the same moral equality, such as Israel, which Israel is a Western democratic nation that is governed by the rule of law, abides by the Geneva Convention. unlike Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are genocidal terrorist organizations that oppress their own people, do not abide by the rule of law, nor do they engage in the Geneva Convention and use women and children as human shields when they fire their rockets and missiles into Israel. Isn't this absolutely shameful on behalf of the International Criminal
It's
Court?
absolutely shameful, but I remember someone once said to me when I was at university, if much of the world had to choose between the Jews and Nazi Germany, guess what? They already chose Nazi Germany. And you couldn't have a more contrast. I mean, Hamas's own covenant of 1987 says they want to kill every Jew in the world, not Israeli, every Jew. It's an openly genocidal quasi-Nazi organization. But The Guardian and many newspapers portray it as collecting garbage, and they're more concerned with running a little state against Israeli oppression. There is no comparison. I mean, that's been one. I mean, a terrorist organization getting to the conference table on parity would be deemed a great success. I think the real issue is we're not dealing with an illegal body. And this is what people have to understand. So the question is, we've got a body masquerading as a legal body coming to legal findings. How do we address it? Well, I don't think we can address it with reason and law. There's got to be some exposure, like the Human Rights Council, with Cuba and Venezuela sitting on it, and Iran and Iraq sitting on disarmament committees. And the British government needs to work closely with the Israelis on this, because it's only a matter of time until British soldiers, like American soldiers, are in the crosshairs of a politicized court. And indeed, a bill is going through Parliament at the moment to try and protect soldiers from never-ending legal actions of faults.
Paul Diamond, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. Thank you for giving us your expert legal opinion, and we all value the superb work you do in defending Christian freedoms in this country, and thank you for defending the one and only Jewish state that is the nation of Israel.
My pleasure.
Well, always thankful for Paul's crystal clear thinking and communication there. That's very good stuff, Simon. Just a reminder to our viewers that we are live and interactive this evening. Has Israel committed war crimes? Has the ICC failed to prosecute genocide? We want to hear from you. We want to hear your views on what we're talking about this evening. So, Simon, what exactly could be the consequence of the ICC's actions for Israeli politicians and personnel?
Well, the big danger is that if they visit countries that have signed up to the International Criminal Court and are member states, those who also signed up to the Rome signatory, the Rome Statute rather, they could be arrested and for war crimes. I think we saw this back in about 2008 and 2009, that Israeli leaders and military officials and politicians were threatened with arrest. This happened in this country. And on one occasion, a leading Israeli military general was on an Israeli plane and was told that if you step off onto British soil, you get arrested. So he got on the next plane and flew back to Tel Aviv. So this is extremely dangerous. It's extremely troubling. But also the other danger I think we have to add on this one is that this is using law, and it's known as lawfare, as a political weapon against Israel. And what it's designed to do is to erode Israel's moral authority and standing in the world, but also to make Israel kind of defenseless, so that Israel can't use her army to protect herself. I mean, this is evil, it's barbaric, and the most disgusting thing about the International Criminal Court is that they haven't recognized the fact that Israel is governed by law. It abides by the Geneva Convention. And in comparison to that of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they don't follow any rules. They deliberately put women and children in harm's way. They deliberately fire their rockets and missiles from schools, from hospitals. They don't care about their own civilians. And when we also look at the ridiculous situation is that the Palestinian Authority does not control Hamas. or Gaza. Hamas control Gaza. So this is a completely different entity in its own right.
Bizarre.
So it doesn't fit any of the criteria. They should never be allowed to become a member of the International Criminal Court because the Palestinian Authority is not a state and therefore they don't qualify as a state or a member, and they're not even allowed to sign up to the Statute of Rome either. So they've bended the rules in favour of the Palestinian Authority. And what has the International Criminal Court done to stop genocide or to bring justice? Nothing. All they've done is single out Israel, the only Jewish state, the only democracy in the Middle East, the only place in the Middle East where the rule of law is upheld and where the Supreme Court can overturn decisions made by the Prime Minister or that from the Israeli Defense Force. It shows you how corrupt this is.
And this also, we have to consider the consequence not only for Israel, but also the ICC. This totally undermines their credibility. This highlights a lack of integrity on their part. So if they persist in this, they're actually putting at risk the peace deals that have already been put in action through the Abraham Accords. We've talked.
It won't affect the Abraham Accords, it'll affect the Oslo Accords.
Do you think that there's any knock-on effect in relation to
the danger is that when anything happens with Israel, first affects Israel, then it'll affect the rest of the world. So the great danger is that if Israel then faces this investigation is allowed to go ahead and they're able to prosecute Israel, the same thing can be said for the British armed forces fighting against Islamic forces either in Iraq or Afghanistan or Northern Ireland, the same with American troops and Western troops. It would just mean it would just be absolutely impossible for soldiers to engage in military warfare. They won't want to engage in military warfare knowing that they could be prosecuted as kind of war criminals. So it's perverse, it's twisted, it's sick, and what it is undermining the moral values of the West, all because we've moved away from our Judeo-Christian heritage. So we've got a good response, haven't we, from Boris Johnson, and thankfully our Prime Minister has responded well to this ICC investigation by defending Israel, and so have many other European nations.
Absolutely. I'll read the letter that's been received from our Prime Minister. This is
sent to us personally, wasn't it?
Yeah. He says, thank you for your letters of 10th of February and 3rd of March regarding your concerns about the International Criminal Court's ruling on the Palestine situation. I'm pleased that you were able to meet with the Foreign Secretary on 9th of March to discuss these concerns in more depth. As you are aware, the UK is a strong supporter of the ICC in line with its founding statute. We've been working with other countries to bring about positive change at the court. This process has been driven by our ambition to strengthen the ICC. The election of two highly qualified UK nationals, Judge Joanna Corner QC and Karim Khan QC, to the roles of judge and prosecutor to the ICC, respectively, will help serve reform. This was a key priority for the UK, demonstrating our enduring commitment to strengthening the court and serving international justice. As a founder member of the ICC, we have been one of its strongest supporters and continue to respect the independence of the institutions. We oppose the ICC's investigation into war crimes in Palestine. We do not accept that the ICC has jurisdiction in this instance, given that Israel is not a party to the Statute of Rome and Palestine is not a sovereign state. This investigation gives the impression of being a partial and prejudicial attack on a friend and ally of the UK's. I hope the discussion with the Foreign Secretary helped to assuage your concerns about the UK's position, and I note his offer to speak with the CFI to explain the UK position in detail. Thank you once again for writing me.
So they're not even allowed to investigate Israel because Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court. I just want to give you a response from the European Union just before we leave this programme, and this makes me really believe in Brexit. It says here that last week an EU spokesman said it has taken careful note of the ruling while exposing strong support for the court. Both the ICC and its prosecutors are independent, impartial judicial institutions, of course they are, with no political objectives to pursue. This is what a European spokesman for the Foreign Affairs, Peter Stanto, told the European Jewish press. He says the EU is a strong supporter of the ICC and of its independence. All EU member states have ratified the Rome Statute. The EU reaffirms its long-standing position in support of a negotiated two-state solution based on internationally agreed parameters. In order for this to be possible, unilateral actions from either side should be avoided and international law upheld. But how can you hold up international law when you're facing genocidal terrorist organizations that want to destroy your state, who do not abide by any international law or any moral code whatsoever? And this makes Brexit so good.
I never thought you believed in Brexit. So.
Oh, well, you know, I just fighting it for the last couple of years, absolutely. But it proves that the EU is in cahoots with the International Criminal Court.
And one thing that's positive, while the EU is in cahoots with them, there are many who are a part of the EU who are not particularly happy.
The Czechs,
are they?
The Czechs, the Hungarians, the Germans,
the Austrians.
The Austrians. There must be some more as well.
Absolutely. So it's really positive that we do see widespread, much wider than perhaps could have been. We'll take the support where...
Lithuanians is another one.
Lithuanians, yeah. It's great that there is that support for Israel, and that each of these nations have clarified their stance in a crystal clear way, saying they do not recognize a Palestinian state. They don't. There are objective reasons for that.
And France is sitting on the fence.
Yeah, France is sitting on the fence, and hopefully at some point they'll show up.
Yeah.
As often happens. So here we have, I'll read out one final. Don't you find it frustrating that the truth about Israel is sidelined for whatever reason? Prayer is so needed for God's chosen nation. Absolutely. And indeed, there is that spiritual element that we have to consider. If we understand God's covenant, it cannot be retracted. It cannot be ended. It is a forever covenant. He has brought the people back to the land. He's going to keep them. He's going to continue to bring more of the Jews of the diaspora back. And he will work out his perfect plan and purpose. He who watches over Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, Psalm 121 reminds us. So it's important for us to continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to continue to pray against corrupt actions that would go against the Jews.
Well, sooner or later, judgment falls.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's whether it's the International Criminal Court or whether it's the EU, once they decide to single out Israel, there are spiritual consequences that they have to pay.
I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you.
Because they are coming against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as you read it in one of my favorite Psalms, he does, when it comes to Israel, he neither sleeps nor he slumbers. So we can rest assured that he is the ultimate one who brings justice. And it's also a reminder to us of the fact that Yeshua HaMashiach is going to return to Jerusalem, where he will stand on the Mount of Olives and he will bring in the millennial reign based on peace, righteousness, and justice. And that is a day that we can all look forward to. We don't need these corrupt global institutions that are based on kind of man's perspective and humanity's perspective that actually throws truth out the window, actually throws law out the window, and decides that what Israel's doing is so-called war crimes, ignoring the real war crimes that are taking place by Hamas against its own people, by his Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and also by ISIS and the brutal, horrendous attacks against Christians. So it's imperative that we stand up, that we pray for Israel, because this is something that's close to the Lord's heart, so it's close to our heart. And it's imperative that we stand with Israel, we pray for Israel, but we see that justice is done. So thank you for watching this edition of Behind the Headlines. Shalom and God bless.